Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Now I've got a special treat for you today because today I'm going to be talking about React. And I'm really excited about this because I've been doing React for about 6 or 7 years now. And I wanted to make this video to basically be the video that I wish I had when I first got it started 6 or 7 years ago. Because when I first started, I was completely overwhelmed. You make functions to render HTML, you mix HTML and JavaScript. It's insane. And after a few years of using it, I learned it's really a whole lot simpler than what I first thought when I first started learning. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through step by step, starting with nothing and showing you piece by piece exactly what you need to know in order to start building React applications today. So what are you waiting for? Let's get started. Before we get to the code, I'm going to start out by just showing you the demo app that we're going to build. So this is a very basic app it's a user manager, has a list of users. You can click on a user, see their details, go back to the user list, and then you can even add a user. And it's down here at the bottom of the list. We jump over to Visual Studio and show you the code. It's very basic, very straightforward. There's the API, there's the fetch calls. That's interacting with that JSON server. And then we have our index.html, just some basic HTML templates that I'm using, and then some basic JavaScript here. So I'm just grabbing data from the API and then rendering it, right? Just using basic DOM, query selectors, and everything. This is the basic application, but let's not spend too much time here because we want to get to the good stuff. How do we re-implement this application in React? So here's our brand new, fresh application. I've copied over that users API that I showed earlier that makes those API calls. And I've created a simple index.html. So this has just very basic stuff. And just so you don't have to watch me type them, I've added a couple of script files here. So I wanted to make this as simple as possible. So I wanted to walk you through, show you only what you needed to know in order to get started with React. And so I'm going to skip all of the installing build systems and everything. I'll show that at the end. For right now, I'm just going to show you what you need to bring in and how you need to use it. So these first two scripts that I'm going to uncomment here are the React library and React-DOM library. Then next up here, this next script we've got is Babel. So I'm actually bringing Babel into the browser. And the only reason I'm doing this is the browsers don't understand JSX. That JSX syntax combining JavaScript and HTML. And so since I want to use that, because I love it, I don't see any other way to use React. There's really no point. I need to bring Babel in, and it's going to do that transpilation in the browser. Now, I would never do this in a production application, just to be very clear. I'm just doing this to show you the simplest, easiest, fastest way to get started. And then last, I'm bringing in index.js. By the way, you can ignore this. This is just for Babel to load it up and load that JSX syntax. That's the only reason I'm doing this. Otherwise, it would just be your typical, type equals application JavaScript. And I'm going to bring in this file that doesn't exist. So let's go ahead and create it now, index.js. So before I even do anything here, let me start my application. And I'm just going to use this live server. Live-server, so npx, and I'm going to run live server. And that's going to bring up a browser here with our application. So we can see nothing's happening here, just an empty file. And if I want to create my React application, what I need to do first is I need to find a DOM element that I want to basically take over and turn into a React application. And that is going to be my div ID root here. So in order to do that, I'm going to use this React DOM library, and I'm going to say React DOM create root. And what I'm going to pass in as a parameter here is the element that I want to create as that root, or I want to use as that root. So get element by ID, and we're getting root. So we're going to get that root element. And then once I have that, we are going to render. Now, what are we going to render? Let's just start by rendering some HTML in here. do our little hello world. As soon as I save this, we see our application reloading on the side over here. Hello world. We've just created our first React application. It's that simple. And by the way, this looks like HTML, but it's actually JSX that Babel has actually taken in and transpiled. And so let's turn this into something a little bit more interesting. We'll use a component, right? My favorite thing about React is that it is a component-based library. So in order to create a component, we simply create a function. I'm going to call my component app. So I've created a component named app here just by defining a function named app. It takes no parameters for right now. And then I'm going to simply return some HTML. In fact, I'm just going to copy and paste this in here. Return hello world. And I'm actually going to say return hello React. So that is my component and simply returns HTML. And now in order to render this, I'm going to call it like it is a custom element. So when you're first using React and learning React, you can think about the React components that you make just like custom HTML elements that you're used to rendering. So you're using a form and a div here, and then you just create a new element. And this one's called app, and then you just use it and render it. So now when I save this, we can see on the right over here, it's updated. Hello React. Let me open up the console down here so we can see what's happening. Now we're getting a warning here. You're using the in-browser Babel transformer. Please be sure to pre-compile your scripts for production. This is just Babel itself saying, look, I don't want to be used this way. Don't bring me in, right? It's talking about this, this import here. Don't do that, right? We're just using it just to learn, and I'll show you how to get rid of that later. But for now, it's pretty clear. No errors. Let's give it some errors. So let's make it a little bit more interesting, and we'll go to my other application, and we will copy and paste some stuff from here. So we already have this CSS, so everything is nice and good looking. Let's just copy this in here. So you can see I have my ID equals root up in here. And so I'm going to copy everything that was in the root, bring it over here, not into my HTML, but actually render it as React. So as we can see over here, it's refreshed. It looks good because I'm using this Tailwind CSS to make everything look good. But we also have a warning down here. Invalid DOM property class. Did you mean class name? So this is an interesting thing about JSX. We're combining HTML and JavaScript. Class is a reserved keyword in JavaScript. But when you use HTML, class is the attribute that you use in order to define CSS class names. So unfortunately, if you are going to copy and paste HTML like this, you're going to have to rename all of these to class name. There's not too many of these attributes, and when you do find them, you'll get these warnings down here in your it will render as you're seeing here. So it's not actually going to break anything, and React will give you those warnings. All right, so now that I've shown you how to render static HTML, let's actually render some dynamic HTML, which is really what we're looking to do here, right? So I'm going to do that by creating a new component called users list. So this is going to be that list of users in our application that the users can click on. So I'm going to start by just creating a new function called users list, and I'm going to return some HTML. And then obviously I will call it just like I rendered my app component. I will simply call this like a regular HTML element. So if I save this, we will see it refreshes and it renders an empty list. I also get these class errors again. Okay, since I copied some existing code, let's go ahead and fix those real quick. Make those errors go away. Once again, I'm rendering some static HTML. Let's get interesting. So what I really want to do is I want to create a variable, a list of users, an array of users. And it's going to look like this. So I've got a regular JavaScript object called users, and it's an array of users. So I've got 2 users. And what I want to do is I want to jump down and I want to iterate through this list. For each of these users in this list, I want to render this list item. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use braces to switch into JavaScript mode and render some stuff. And then I'm just going to map and iterate over that array. So for each user in the array, I'm going to call a function and return a value. So this is an arrow function. If you're not familiar with that, I could just as easily have gone like this, that full-blown function definition, but I like to use arrow functions here. They're a little bit nicer. And then so for each of these users, I want to render this li. I'm going to render an li for each of them. And then I am going to dynamically render their name. So I'm going to say user.name. So what have I done here? I've switched to JavaScript mode with these braces, and I started rendering some JavaScript. I iterated over this array, and then I switched back into HTML mode to render an li, and then back into JavaScript mode to actually render the value of the user.name property. So now when I save, we can look over to the right and see the list is rendered out. So for each of those users, I've rendered an li item. We also have some warnings here. Each child in a list should have a unique key prop. Now, what this is referring to is the fact that when React renders our application, it calls these functions. Every time it renders the function and it takes that output of the function, it looks at that virtual DOM, that in-memory DOM, and it compares, this is the last time I ran it, this is this time that I ran it, what is the diff? And for those differences, that's what I'm going to update in the actual DOM. Now, where the key comes into play is when we're rendering a list like this, React wants to know exactly what DOM element refers to or connects with each item in this list, right? So it doesn't necessarily know that the first item in the list is always test user 1, because what if I reorder them, right? What if I move Frank Sinatra up and then re-render the list? It won't know. And so when it doesn't know, it just re-renders everything. It runs through this whole thing and it says, well, I haven't been told how to differentiate between them, so I'm going to re-render all of these LIs. So to avoid that, we simply give a key property. This is a React attribute. And we give it some unique identifier for each item in the list. So luckily for our users, they each have unique IDs. And so we'll just use that. So now when I save that, re-render, we can see that error is gone. So now that we're rendering out dynamic HTML, let's interact with the user. Let's receive some click events, right? So what if the user wants to go ahead and click on these users in our application on this list, and then we want to, eventually we want to, show that pop up, redirect them somewhere. How do we receive that click? So just like I said earlier, dealing with JSX and creating React components, you can think of it a lot like using HTML components. So in order to listen to let's say a click event, you simply say on click, and then you assign a click handler. So what is the handler? It's a function that you call when that event happens. And so here we can simply say, whenever somebody clicks, we can do a console log. So we will log user, right? So every time somebody clicks on here, we should see a log written out with the username that was clicked. So that's handling events. Now let's get a little more advanced here. Once again, what I love a lot about React and JSX is that it is component-based. It encourages you to make small components. Frankly, this component is already getting a little bit too big for me. So I want to break it up. And this is actually a great place to break things up. When you're in the midst of iterating over a list and rendering things out, this is a natural place to create a new component. So let's go ahead and do that. So I will create a component called users list item, and come down here, define the component, users list item, and return that li. So I literally just copied and pasted that code that was running previously. Now, where are these things coming from, right? So previously I was accessing this user property. Also, the first thing I'm going to do, since you actually don't need the key defined at this level. This is a common mistake that a lot of beginners will make. They really don't know where to put that key. We're actually going to bring this key back up and we're going to put it on the component. Notice I didn't define anything in here. This is actually React functionality. It's a React attribute that we can put on here. And so we just put it on arbitrarily on any component. So now how do we get access to this user property that we need, this user variable? Well, again, we treat it just like HTML and we just make up a new attribute and pass it in. So I'll call it user and just pass it in using JavaScript, plain old JavaScript. So here's that open braces and then pass in that user value. And then in my function, I'm going to receive what React calls props. And that is simply a parameter of the function that is called whatever you want it to be called. Traditionally, it's called props. And so from this props value, this is where all of the attributes that have been defined or set on from the caller, they get passed into properties on this parameter. So from here, I can say const user equals props.user. So this directly corresponds to this, which I then just pull off, and now I can use it. So now if I save and reload, everything is working exactly as it was before. I simply refactored. Now, this is obviously works just fine, but what a lot of people like to do is use JavaScript destructuring on these props, and instead of making a props variable that you access like this, you simply pull off those props right from the get-go. And so you have it available right away, right? So this is the syntax a lot of people use. It's simply the JavaScript destructuring syntax if you've never seen it before. So this is nothing specific to do with React. It's actually JavaScript, but I simply am pulling off this user property that's being passed in from here so that I can use it. Again, I'll save, it'll update, everything's working fine. Now, just as you can pass properties or values into the component can trigger events back up and interact with its parents. So this is actually a great example right here. Often when you create a component like this and you have something like, say, a click handler here, you don't actually want to handle it in the component itself. You want to raise up this event to the parents and have somebody else handle it for you. So I'm going to do something else when a click event happens. And so in order to do that, I am going to simply define another prop up here called on user selected or clicked or whatever I want to call it. And then I'll simply move this event up here, this function here, when it's being called. So now I'm saying whenever this on user selected event or handler is called, go ahead and execute this code. And I pass this in as a prop. And when it comes in, it is simply a function that can be called from my component. And I can simply pass that into this onClick handler. So once again, when I save and I click, we can see that it's still working. So these are very underwhelming demos because I'm not actually changing, I'm just refactoring. But by showing you this, you can see that it is still working exactly as anticipated, except it's not this component that's handling the event. The event is getting not only passed up to the parent, but actually redefined and renamed. And so it's no longer a click anymore. It's that the user was selected, right? It's something meaningful to my application and my domain and that component. Now let's talk about managing state. How does React manage state? So when we have variables that we want to store in our components and remember them, update them, spit them back out, do whatever, how does React handle that? Well, let's see. Let's start out with what you might want to do, right? So I created this users array and then I just iterated over it and that worked just fine. So let's create some variable. Let's just implement a simple counter, right? And so I'll implement a variable count and I'll initialize it to 0. I'll update this event handler to say whenever a user is selected or clicked, we update that count. Plus equal 1. Set that count plus equal to 1. And then down here, we will simply render that count. So we'll say current count. So current count is 0. We're off to a great start, right? Now, if I click it, you might not hear me. I'm clicking. Nothing is happening. Why not? what happens? So when React renders our components, it executes these functions every single time. And so what's happening is the first time this component is rendered, everything works great, right? And so the value of count is rendered out and it looks just fine. Now, this event handler is actually working. It is updating the value of this variable, but then when React goes to re-render this component, it recreates a new count variable, sets that variable to 0, and re-renders everything. So it's not storing anything. It gets blown away every single time. So how do we maintain them throughout renders? Let's look. We use the React useState function. You can call it just like this without any parameters, or you can call it with the default value. What this does is it reserves some memory somewhere else that React then ties to this component so we can access it over re-render. So each time we call this, React goes and looks in that memory and says, oh, the current state is this. Or in this case, in the initial run, it says, oh, this doesn't exist. Let me reserve it or create it over here, initialize it to 0 in this case. And then any subsequent runs, it'll go and pull that value back and give it to us in a variable. What is the variable now? What is the return value of this? Actually, if we hover over it, we can see it's actually a tuple. It's an array with two values. The first value is the actual current value or count. And the second value of this array is the setter, the function that you can use to update that value in memory. So I can say set count. You can call it whatever you want. I'm going to call mine set count. And so what I can do here is, this is the correct logic, but what I need to do is I need to call this setter and pass that new value in. So whenever this is clicked, we call that set count, we update that value in memory. That triggers React to actually call and execute this function again. But this time, we're going and retrieving that updated value, getting that value, and rendering it out. So if I save this, now I can click, and now our click handler is working. And I can even convert this to a const, because we're getting this value fresh every single time. It is a constant value. We're not changing it within the flow of the function. We're changing it by updating the state using the set count or the setter function. All right, now let's talk about how to execute logic when a component runs or renders for the first time, let's say. So let's start off by, what if we want to watch and see when this count value changes and then react to that, do something in reaction to that changing? The React way to do that is to use the useEffect function. So react.useEffect. And this function accepts two parameters. The first parameter is the function or callback that will be executed whenever the effect is needed. And the second parameter is an array of variables or values to watch. And whenever any of these values changes, this function or callback will be executed. So for example, if we want to watch and see anytime the count is updated, execute a function and let's say log it out to the console. Now, when we reload and we click on these, you can see not only is my counter working, but I'm actually rendering those values out. Notice here that we have current count equals 0, or current count 0 was logged to the console, meaning when we initially executed this function, the effect, this value was different. It was different in that it was nothing, and then it changed to something, and that something just happened to be 0. And so when you're using the useEffect function, pay special attention to when and how often this is going to run. So this is actually the source of many bugs and even performance issues, having too many useEffects or running them too often. So be very careful about the values you're watching and the code that you're executing in these useEffects functions. Speaking of which, so now what if you want to run some code only the first time that a function is called? So the way to do that is to simply eliminate any of the parameters from the watch list or any of those values from that watch list. And so you'll notice down here, current count 0 is rendered the first time. And now when I click, it's no longer rendered because this dependency list has not updated. Even though this component function keeps getting called over and over again, and the count is changing, the dependency list is not changing, so the function is not called. Where you will often see this is let's say fetching data whenever a component is rendered. So the very first time that a component is rendered, go make a call out to an API or something, get that data. So let's implement that here. So instead of hard coding this users list, let's actually turn this into React useState, and we'll give it an empty array to start with. And then likewise, we'll do users and then set users to get our setter function. And then when we first load, we will call set users. If I save this, reload, we can see it works, right? So what actually happened that happened too quickly for us to see was the first time that this component was rendered, users was actually an empty array. And so this was rendered out with an empty users list. So it was a UL with no list items, but then we quickly ran this useEffect function, set the users, it re-rendered, and before we could even notice, the list was populated. So now let's get this from the API. So again, there's this users API that I brought in, and we will call this load users. So we will say, let's go ahead and import it from up here. Oh, nope. And then we will call that. So when we load, we will call the load users. This returns a promise. So we will call that promise and pass in that users list that we got back into this set users function. So we will pass that right in. Or to simplify this, we can simply call this setter directly, right? Remember, this is a function that we can call, right? So this is the long form version of it, or this is the shorter form. So when the component is first rendered, call the load users function, set the users that come back from the server to this list here. So if I save this and it refreshes over here, we can see we have our fully populated list with users from the server. At this point in the video, I've showed you pretty much everything you'd need to know in order to build at least a simple React application, if not a relatively advanced one. So from here on out, I'm going to get into a few slightly more advanced topics that you might not necessarily use every day, but when you do need them, they're there for you. So the first topic that I want to talk about is hooks. So you will actually be using a lot of kind of out-of-the-box hooks. In fact, useEffect and useState are actually hooks that React provides for you. They're out of the box. And so a hook is simply a function that you call that contains logic. It doesn't return markup or anything like that, although it can. You don't typically see that. It generally has some logic, and sometimes it doesn't return anything at all, but usually it will return some value that you need. So a great example is this users list that I just created here. So if I wanted to get a list of users in a bunch of different components, and I wanted to reuse this logic, yes, I could copy and paste it around everywhere, or I can turn it into a reusable hook. And the way that I do that is simply create a function, surprisingly enough. And the function has to be prefixed with, or the beginning has to be use. So use XYZ. React will yell at you if you don't do this. So I'm going to say use users, unfortunately. And I'm going to create this function, and I'm simply going to cut this code, paste it in here. So logically speaking, you can see it is the same code. It's a simple refactoring. I've just moved it around, and now I'm only going to return the actual user's value that came back, the current state of users. Now down here, I can say const users equals use users. And what this will do is every single time the component is rendered, because remember, all of the logic in the function is executed each time the component is rendered. Every time the component is rendered, we're going to call this function. So this code is exactly the same as it was before. It's just encapsulated in another function. And then the net result here now is users. It's this simple users value. So if I just look at this, it's a lot simpler, a lot easier to use. If I save, we'll see the page reloads. Our users are still there. And that is a hook. We're in the home stretch here. We're almost done. We've got one more concept that I want to show before we convert this application to actually a production application and get rid of that inline Babel and whatnot. But before we do that, I want to kind of put everything that I've shown you into practice and create a form, because what application doesn't have a form? So I'm actually going to paste this in real quick, and then I will walk through and show you every bit of it. All right, so here I've pasted in a new component called add new user form. It takes in a callback on user created. So this is going to trigger a function with the parameter of the actual user that was submitted or created once this form has done what it needed to do. And it's only going to have two input fields here. We can see there's a name and an email address. And so I'm going to store those using React state here. So the first two lines, I'm going to create empty state. So they're initially going to be empty, no value. And then when I come down here and I want to actually accept those changes, whenever someone types into these form fields, that is going to trigger the onChange event. And so on that event, what happens here is I'm going to grab that event. So this is going to be an HTML input element event. And this is now just kind of regular DOM events. Now it's a special React wrapper around the DOM event, but what's in here is going to look a lot like that DOM event that you're used to. So I'm going to take the event, the target from that event, and then the value. So I'm actually getting that value property off of that input element, that input HTML element that we've attached this event to. And then I'm going to call the name setter. I'm going to set name and update the value of that state. So this will trigger every single time the user changes the value in that field. In other words, every single time they press a new key, this event will trigger and we're going to update that value, which will then actually cause a re-render of this whole function, of this whole component. But because of that virtual DOM, it doesn't cost that much, right? Next, we actually pass that value back into the input element as the current value. So as that value updates, as the name in this case updates, we're going to re-render that component with the new value of name. And then whenever the user taps a new key to change that, we're going to update that value, re-render it with the new value. So likewise, on another input element, this one is the type email, but it's the same thing. We've got this value and then an onChange. And then finally, we come down here and it's a simple submit button. Right? So this is all wrapped in a form. And then I just use HTML. I'm actually not listening to a click handler on this button. I'm simply letting it be a regular HTML submit button, which will then trigger the onSubmit function on the form. And that I am handling with an event handler. So in here, we can see we're getting this event. And it is a form submit event. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to prevent the default, because we don't want that basic browser behavior of actually posting back to the server. No, we're going to handle it on the browser. So we're going to prevent default, cancel that event from doing anything else. And then we'll call this users API. We're actually just going to call the create user function from the users API, which I will now import from up here. So whenever this submit happens, we're going to create user and we're going to pass in the current value of the name and the email state into our server, which will then create that user on the server. It'll return that created user. We'll log that out, and then we'll call this callback function back up to whomever actually triggered this. So now we'll wire this thing back into our application, and we will do that right about here. So this is the button the add user button that we're going to listen to. And the way that we're going to implement this is we're going to create a variable that says whether or not this new user form field should be shown. So we are going to create a new variable, show new user dialog, which indicates whether or not we should render this thing. And when show new user dialog is true, we will render out our add new user form component. Then we will wire this up to the button. So on click of the button, set show new user dialog true. So go ahead and show the dialog whenever the add user button is clicked. And then once the user is created, we're going to go ahead and close that dialog. So we are going to set show new user dialog false. So this will be false. This will no longer be rendered and the dialog will go away. So let's go ahead and try it out. So we'll say add user, and here's our new user form. We'll say add that new user. And we can see that it returned back, but it didn't actually reload the users list. Now, if I manually reload, we can see that that call has been made and re-rendered, and we've gotten that new user. And that's it. That is a form. So just as I said, this might look big, but there is nothing here that I haven't already shown you, right? So we have useState that we're using to handle the state or the values that the user has entered in as the username and email. And then this might look overwhelming, but we're simply just using properties, right? We're passing properties on the HTML input fields, and we're listening to events and reacting to them. And then also listening to the onSubmit event and handling that. So if you just kind of squint your eyes and look at this, this actually just kind of looks like HTML and listening to DOM events. And that is what React should feel like. Now that I've shown you how simple it is to create a React application from scratch using nothing but HTML and JavaScript, let's now go back to the beginning where I imported these scripts and talked about how awful this was and how I would never, ever do this in a production application. Let's convert this application to an actual production application. So let's get rid of this. Get rid of these Babel imports, and I'm going to import this as a module, type module. So that simply means it tells the browser that I'm actually using ES6 module imports in here, which I am. So that's the first step. So now I've removed all of this. Obviously now if I save this and reload, it'll break. Nothing's loading anymore. So let's go ahead and fix this. The first thing I'm going to do is turn this into an npm project, right? So I'm going to run npm init-y. That's going to create my package.json, and then I'm going to install the packages React and React DOM. So those are the two packages that I was using, and then I'll go up here and I will import them into my page. So I'm going to add import React from React and import React DOM from React-DOM. So now all of these imports will actually be using those React libraries. So I can save this. And then it's time to actually bundle and run this application. So you've got a whole slew of choices for bundlers out there. What I like to use, my favorite bundler as of right now, is Vite. So I'm going to install that, npm install Vite as a dev dependency. And then I'm simply going to run npx Vite. So this is one of my favorite things about Vite. It does accept a lot of configuration options, but you can actually run it using just the default configuration. And so now that it's running, I can open up my new website and we can see that it's loading over here, complete with this current count and all. And so that's it. I've now converted this to a production application. This is ready to go live, and that's it. We're all done. Now, if you've been watching the channel for any amount of time, you'll know that I am a huge TypeScript fanboy. So it won't come as much of a surprise to you to know that whenever I write React applications, I don't use JavaScript like this. I use TypeScript. So that is obviously outside of the scope of this video. This video is just how to get up and running simply, but when you are ready to go to the next level and actually use TypeScript to build maintainable React applications, check out my video that is coming up soon about how to convert your React applications to TypeScript. Until then, keep coding, and I'll see you later.